A compass has only one purpose: to tell you which direction is true. But imagine carrying a compass whose needle changed according to popular opinion. Politicians, judges, culture, or simply whichever direction the majority wanted to travel. You wouldn't have a compass. You'd have a weather vane. And yet, isn't that increasingly what we're doing with morality? Which raises a question we don't ask nearly enough. Who gave mankind the authority to move true north? Maybe we didn't. Maybe right and wrong were never ours to define in the first place. Maybe the moral compass was already here, because someone put it within us. I'm Michael Allen Brown, and we're on the brink. Coming to you from the MAB Podcast Network, this is On the Brink with Michael Allen Brown. Good morning and welcome to another episode of On the Brink. There are laws enacted by legislatures, laws interpreted by courts. And then there is something considerably older than all of them. There is the moral law. Before Congress, before the Supreme Court, before the Constitution, human beings understood that certain things were right and certain things were wrong. Do not murder. Do not steal. Do not bear false witness. Protect the innocent. Deal honestly with your neighbor. Keep your word. Where did those principles come from? The biblical premise is profound. They originate with God. The Apostle Paul writes in Romans chapter 2 of people who did not possess the written law, yet demonstrated the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness. Think about that. Written in their hearts, their conscience bearing witness. There is within mankind an awareness that some things are right and some things are wrong. Not because Congress passed a law, not because a judge issued a ruling, not because society conducted a vote. There is a moral law, and behind that moral law stands a moral lawgiver. But if God's moral law is written upon the human heart, how can people become capable of terrible wrongdoing and seemingly experience no remorse? Scripture addresses that as well. In 1 Timothy chapter 4, it's spoken of by, quote, having their conscience seared with a hot iron. Think about that imagery. When flesh is badly burned, it can lose sensitivity. Something that ordinarily produces feeling no longer does. Paul applies that imagery to the conscience. The moral law hasn't changed. True north has not moved. But our sensitivity to it has become damaged, ignored often enough, resisted often enough, rationalized repeatedly enough. And what once troubled the conscience may eventually trouble it very little. Ephesians chapter 4 gives us haunting description with the words past feeling. Something that once produced shame no longer produces shame. Something that once produced remorse no longer produces remorse. What once caused the conscience to shout, "This is wrong," may eventually produce scarcely a whisper. And perhaps this explains at least one dimension of the human capacity for terrible violence. There are many factors involved in human behavior, and none of us can see into another person's heart. But Scripture does warn that a conscience can become seared. A heart can become hardened. A person can become past feeling. The standard hasn't changed. Our sensitivity to the standard has. Can a culture become desensitized? Now consider something larger. Can what happens to an individual also happen to a civilization? Can a culture become desensitized? Can something regarded as morally acceptable by one generation become tolerated by the next, accepted by another, and eventually celebrated? If so, perhaps the most dangerous stage of moral decline isn't when society knowingly does wrong. It comes when society becomes so desensitized that it can no longer feel what something and when something is wrong. And now we arrive at a central question, and that is, who gets to define morality? We increasingly hear, "That's your truth. This is my truth." But if morality is entirely subjective, there ultimately is no right or wrong. There are only preferences. If morality originates exclusively with human beings can redefine it. That is why there must be a standard above government, above courts, above politicians, and above popular opinion. Otherwise, mankind becomes both the author and the editor of morality. And this is where the conversation becomes difficult. Consider abortion. I recognize that Americans profoundly disagree about it. Some argue bodily autonomy. Others disagree about when full mortal status begins. I understand those arguments exist, but I want to ask a different question. What happens to a society when the value of innocent human life becomes conditional? From my Christian worldview, human beings possess inherent value because they are created in the image of God. From that premise, the unborn child represents human life at its most vulnerable and defenseless stage. So I find myself asking, if terminating that developing human life becomes morally acceptable under certain circumstances, what effect might that have upon our collective understanding of the sanctity of human life itself? Now, I'm not saying that someone who supports abortion therefore supports violence across the board. They do not. And I'm not claiming abortion causes other forms of violence. I'm asking about the underlying moral principle. If human worth becomes dependent upon circumstances, wantedness, development, dependency, or someone else's determination of value, where does that principle end? Today, the question may concern the unborn child. Tomorrow, it may concern someone at the opposite end of life, an elderly person, someone with dementia, someone who is profoundly disabled, someone completely dependent upon others. And the questions can begin changing. What can this person contribute? What is their quality of life? How dependent have they become? What does their care cost? And here is the danger. Human dignity cannot depend upon usefulness. It cannot depend upon productivity, age, health, independence, or whether another person considers that life wanted. Because the moment human worth becomes something that we assign, it becomes something that we can withdraw. That is the principle that concerns me. The Christian proposition is radically different. The unborn child has value. The healthy human adult has value. The disabled person has value. The person with dementia has value. And the 95-year-old lying helplessly in a nursing home bed has value. Not because of what any of them can produce, not because government granted them value, but because they are human beings, created in the image of God. Human dignity does not increase with usefulness, and it does not diminish with dependency. And this brings us directly to the American experiment. Liberty requires restraint. A genuinely freed society depends upon millions of people choosing not to do everything that they are physically capable of doing. I could steal, but I don't. I could deceive someone who trusts me, but I don't. Why? Government cannot monitor every human interaction. Police cannot stand inside of every home. Courts cannot supervise every promise. Something must govern us when government isn't watching. Character, conscience, moral restraint. George Washington understood this. In his farewell address of 1796, he said, "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. Not helpful, not preferable, indispensable." 2 years later, John Adams put the principle even more forcefully when he said, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people, and it is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." The Constitution can limit government, but it cannot manufacture character. The Bill of Rights can protect liberty, but it cannot teach someone how liberty should be used. The court can punish dishonesty, but it cannot make someone honest. Government can restrain behavior, but it cannot manufacture virtue. And herein lies one of the greatest paradoxes of freedom. The more individuals govern themselves, the less government must govern them. And the less individuals govern themselves, the more government eventually must. When personal restraint disappears, external restraint takes its place. That is why morality and liberty are not enemies. They are inseparable. True north. So let's return to the compass. Where does our moral compass come from? I submit to you, mankind didn't create it. God did. Scripture says God's law is written upon the human heart, with conscience bearing witness. Scripture also warns that conscience can become seared, the heart hardened, and mankind become past feeling. But none of that changes the standard. Our refusal to look at the compass does not move north. Our rejection of the standard does not abolish the standard. And changing public opinion does not change what is true. Perhaps the greatest danger facing civilization isn't simply that human beings do wrong. We always have. The greater danger may come when civilization loses the ability or the courage to call anything wrong at all. A civilization without true north may continue moving, It may become wealthier, more technologically sophisticated, more powerful. It may even call that movement progress. But movement and progress are not necessarily the same thing. Because if you don't know where north is, you cannot know whether you're traveling in the right direction. Liberty requires virtue, and virtue requires a standard greater than ourselves. Government did not create that standard. Culture didn't create it. Mankind didn't create it. And mankind does not possess the authority to move true north. The question is whether we are willing to follow that compass. I'm Michael Allen Brown, and this has been On The Brink.